I'm delighted to welcome you to what is, by my calculation, the 13th Milton Lecture. All traditions at their root are invented, but I'd like to think that this one is slowly but surely taking root. So my name is David Leopold, and I teach political theory in the Department of Politics and International Relations. But I'm also a tutor at Mansfield, and my college fellowship, like today's lecture, is named after John Milton. I'm very pleased to have that association. Negatively, I'm relieved to have dodged a bullet. I have political theory colleagues whose fellowships elsewhere in the university are named after Russian oligarchs and Czech-born pension fraudsters. And positively, I'm happy because amongst Milton's many associations are some powerful connections to the concerns of political theory. Not least, Milton is now widely understood as a persuasive defender of a free press and a sophisticated advocate of Republican freedom. Milton's connections with Mansfield College, we should probably admit, are a little indirect, but they're not entirely without foundation, and they are eminently material. Milton was an inspirational historical figure for the nonconformists who established the college in the late 19th century. They viewed him as a spiritual and political fellow traveller who shared their own commitment to religious freedom and who they could posthumously adopt in order to lend his intellectual authority to their educational endeavours. And with that aspirational ambition, they built Milton into the very fabric of the college. I usually mention that his statue, which you can make out on the kind of tower above the original college buildings, above the main door, but it's as well to admit that kind of age and the weather makes him rather hard to identify from the ground, at least with any confidence. But he also appears nearly life-sized and much more recognisable, the name tag helps, in the stained glass of the chapel, and I recommend you seek him out. He stands bookish and serious with remarkably stocky legs and a proclivity for dressing entirely in brown, right, in the second of the west-facing windows. This annual lecture and my college fellowship are named after Milton at the request of Charles Brock and due to the generosity of Charles and Carolyn Brock and of Mary Lincoln. I hope that Mary, Charles's widow, might be joining us online. It's very revealing that when they became generous benefactors to Mansfield, they didn't want their own names to be given prominence, but rather that of one of their heroes. Charles, who sadly died in 2023, was a fellow and chaplain at Mansfield for some 35 years. He was a much-loved member of college, helping it become the kind of open and friendly community that Oxford colleges always say they are, but infamously don't always succeed in being. Charles also played a crucial part in the more contemporary history of the college, facilitating the complex process whereby Mansfield evolved out from its nonconformist religious foundation to become a more normalised component of the collegiate university. That complex relation between politics and religion was central both to the recent history and the college's origins. It's also at the heart of the work of this year's Milton lecturer, Nicholas McDowell. I won't list all his many distinctions here, but Professor McDowell, who holds a chair at the University of Essex, has written widely on literature and culture in the period 1500 to 1800. In addition to work on Swift, Sterne and Rabelais, he is the author of a 2-volume intellectual biography of Milton. The first volume, Poet of Revolution, The Making of John Milton, was published to enthusiastic reviews in 2020, and the second volume, Prophet of Liberty, The Rise and Fall of John Milton, is keenly awaited. That biography traces the complex interaction between writer and context, a process that saw Milton become, perhaps surprisingly, politicised, and in due course emerge as both the author of the greatest epic poem in English and a radicalised spokesperson for a revolution. Professor McDowell's talk today addresses the thorny issue of what we can learn from the mighty dead. Its title is Lessons in Free Speech from John Milton. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks for coming on such a In his prose works, Milton gave Western liberalism some of the language through which it still can. For the First Amendment of the US Constitution. The only book known to bear the signatures of both Jefferson and James Madison is this copy of Paradise Lost, published in Dublin in 1751. The attraction for the American founding fathers of Paradise Lost was not only the sublime poetry, but the career of the author as a spokesman for liberty. An abridged translation of Areopagitica into French by the revolutionary leader Mirabeau went through 4 editions between 1788 and 1792 as the French Revolution unfolded. And the persistent resonance of Areopagitica for American ideals of the free exchange of ideas is apparent to anyone who's been to the New York Public Library. This is a plaque on Library Way, which bears a quotation from the pamphlet beside an image of a printing press. Where there is much desire to learn, there of necessity will be much arguing, much writing, many opinions. For opinion in good persons is but knowledge in the making. And I'll just note there that Milton says in good persons, and that's something I'll be coming back to. More prominent, if you've been to the library, is the quotation displayed above the entrance to the main reading room, the magnificent main reading room, which opened in 1911. And there they've kept the original spelling of the 17th century text. I hope you can read it there. A good book is the precious lifeblood of a master spirit, embalmed and treasured up on purpose to a life beyond life. Since the mid-20th century, however, Areopagitica has been invoked less by those who would proclaim the triumph of liberty than by those anxious about the forgetting of Milton's lessons in free speech. It's not a coincidence that the first Italian translation was published in 1933, the year in which all university lecturers in Italy were required to be members of the National Fascist Party. An essay published in 1944 by an American scholar entitled Areopagitica Revisited opened by declaring, quote, that it would be a monstrous irony if in the midst of a war fought partly for the preservation and extension of freedom of speech, we should overlook the tercentenary of one of the most important and certainly the most eloquent defenses of a free press. which was ostensibly being commemorated, to be an indication of the failure of his contemporaries to live up to the ideals that they claimed to promote. Orwell goes on in the essay to warn of the twin threats posed to intellectual liberty by its theoretical enemy, totalitarianism, on the one hand, and by its practical enemy, monopoly. At this meeting. But most recently, the rise of digital media and events in the US have provoked skepticism that Milton's arguments have any relevance to the 21st century world. According to the introduction to a collection of essays by legal scholars published just last year under the title Disinformation, Misinformation, and Democracy, the lessons of the 2020 general election in the USA and Trump's big lie seem to teach us that Milton, in his iconic Areopagitica, was just plain wrong. Now, I'm not sure how Milton would feel about being described as iconic, but it is a claim to which I'll return at the end of my talk, that Milton has been proven to be wrong in the contemporary world. Okay, so I want to go back and explain to you where Milton's ideas about thinking hard about how censorship and state persecution suppressed intellectual and literary achievement for some years prior to Areopagitica. After leaving Christ's College, Cambridge in 1632, he had embarked on an intensive period of reading about the history of Europe and become particularly interested in episodes of literary censorship in Italy, the country in which he lived and travelled from 1638 to 1639, and in whose language he was fluent. Milton's fascination with the topic of censorship and the Catholic Church's index of prohibited books is evident in his surviving notebook or commonplace book, compiled mostly during the late 1630s and early 1640s. And that's an image from it. It's in the British Library, an amazing resource to have. Milton would have had other commonplace books. This one happens to have survived, and helpfully it's full of the kind of reading he was doing in preparation for works like Areopagitica. Milton gathered a list of entries to do with the prohibition of books, among other topics. The two major intellectual figures also that Milton tells us he visited during his European tour of 1638 to 9 were the Dutch polymath Hugo Grotius, an exile in Paris for his theological views, and Galileo, placed under house arrest in Florence since 1633 for his belief that the earth moved around the sun. The meeting with Galileo is recounted in a key moment in Areopagitica, as Milton warns Parliament that the adoption of such measures as the licensing order would foster in England, as it had in Italy under the Index, a national sense of fear and servility, inimical believes can be created under such conditions of intellectual enslavement. And indeed, in one of his polemics against the Episcopal Church of England in 1642, Milton had already declared that he would be prevented from fulfilling his own ambition to write an epic poem in English that would equal the achievement of Homer and Virgil. Intentions, he says, that which have lived within me ever since I could conceive myself anything worth to my country, until the nation had enfranchised herself from this impertinent yoke of prelacy, the bishops, under whose inquisitorious and tyrannical duncery no free and splendid wit can flourish. Milton's really going full barrel here with his prose, first in this earlier tract where he attacks the Church of England. But you can see how his reading about the Inquisition is shaping his ideas about the Church of England. What must Milton have made then of the petition from the Stationers' Company to Parliament in April 1643, calling for the Licensing Act to be reinstated? Incredibly, given Parliament was in the midst of a war that was being fought partly out of the fear that England under Charles I was backsliding into Roman Catholicism, the petition praises the Inquisition for its efficacy. We must in this give the Papists their due, for as well where the Inquisition predominates as not, regulation is more strict by far than it is amongst Protestants. We are not so wise in our generation, nor take so much care to preserve the true religion, as they do the false from alteration. Far from being the engine of popular reformation that Milton envisages in Areopagitica, the Stationers' Company lamented that unregulated printing hath of late been the fuel in some measure of this miserable civil war by deceiving the multitude. Well, it's fairly extraordinary of the Stationers' Company to cite the Inquisition as their model for licensing. Now, as the title of his tract indicates, Milton turned to ancient Greek values in asserting the importance of speaking truth to power. The title page of Areopagitica bears a motto from Euripides' tragedy, The Suppliants. What can be juster in a state than this? These lines invoke the Athenian concept of parrhesia, and you can see the term there in the second quotation, a form of free and bold speech usually voiced by a distinguished citizen addressing a public assembly on a controversial matter. Edward Phillips, Milton's nephew and his pupil from the age of 10, being taught by Milton from the age of 10 must have been an experience. Milton's nephew and pupil from the age of 10 defines parrhesia as liberty in speaking. In rhetoric, it is a figure in which we speak boldly and freely in things displeasing and obnoxious to envy. So Milton represents himself as a bold speaker of truth, whose love of liberty has impelled him to criticize Parliament publicly at some risk to his own safety. The epigraph from Euripides thus prepares the reader of Areopagitica for the free speech that Milton will exercise in his criticism of Parliament, and that in support of the practice of which he writes. His own boldness in airing his views is evidence of his expectation that the MPs will abide by the conventions of Parrhesia and listen without censure to a citizen offering sincere criticism. And there is a picture of Parliament, 1624. Now, obviously, within Parliament, as there still is today, there was a convention of free speech within the doors of Parliament. Now, while Milton did not, as far as we know, turn up in person outside the doors of Parliament to deliver his speech, he represents himself as the voice of reason, which Parliament should both acknowledge and obey, from what quarter soever it be heard speaking. And while Milton does not quite claim to speak on behalf of the people, Areopagitica is distinguished by its magnificent visions of post-Civil War London, made free from the constraint of licensing, as a city of scholar labourers. And this is one of the sort of high points of Milton's prose, certainly one of the high points of Areopagitica. Behold now this vast city, it's London, that Milton's envisaging after the Civil War. A city of refuge, the mansion house of liberty, encompassed and surrounded with his protection, God's protection. The shop of war hath not there more anvils and hammers waking, to fashion out the plates and instruments of armed justice in defence of beleaguered truth, than there be pens and heads there, sitting by their studious lamps, musing, searching, revolving new notions and ideas, wherewith to present, as with their homage and their fealty, the approaching Reformation. others as fast reading, trying all things, assenting to the force of reason and convincement. What could a man require more from a nation so pliant and so prone to seek after knowledge? What wants there to such a towardly and pregnant soil, but wise and faithful labourers, to make a knowing people, a nation of prophets, of sages, and of worthies? Now, that's a stirring passage, and it's probably the high point of Milton's revolutionary excitement, even though he went on to defend the execution of Charles I. He seeks to extend the privilege of free speech that was a convention within the doors of Parliament out into the streets and private houses of London. By presenting his own printed work as a speech, he plays upon the technological developments in print that have expanded political discussion beyond the confines of Parliament and into the streets of the city. However, by 1644, Milton's vision of the regeneration of the City of London depended upon the people's political representatives, Parliament, to reverse a decision they had already made in the form of the Licensing Act. The fact that Areopagitica itself appeared unlicensed was both a demonstration of the inefficacy of the law and an active resistance to it. Indeed, in the weeks following the publication of Areopagitica, Milton must have been concerned that his own physical liberty was again at stake. The House of Lords Journal for the 20th of December 1644, about 5 weeks after Areopagitica was published, records that Mr. Justice Reeves and Mr. Justice Bacon have been appointed to examine Milton and another writer, Hezekiah Woodward, concerning the printing and publishing their books and pamphlets, as they were to be brought before the judges. And the stationers, that's the Stationers' Company, are to be present at their examinations and give evidence against them. According to one of Milton's early biographers, Milton was arraigned before the House of Lords, but that House, whether approving the doctrine or not favouring his accusers, soon dismissed him. So we don't know too much more about that, but it's pretty clear that Milton was examined over his publication of Areopagitica. Milton's printed petition to Parliament also fell on deaf ears. The Licensing Act was not repealed for the rest of the Civil War. And in September 1649, 8 months after the execution of Charles I and the proclamation of a Commonwealth and Free State, the new Republican Parliament passed an act against unlicensed and scandalous books and pamphlets, which essentially reasserted the conditions of the 1643 Licensing Act. Moreover, Milton, in the role of Secretary for Foreign Tongues, to which he had been appointed by the new Republican government in February 1649, himself became involved in licensing books before they were published. Not unreasonably, this development has been seen by some as evidence of rank hypocrisy on Milton's part, although there is some evidence that he sought to hold to the principles that he advanced in Areopagitica while serving in public office. And it should be remembered that no great writer has ever been closer to the mechanisms of power than Milton in the 1650s. It's important to recognize, however, that Milton didn't conceive of free speech as most Western societies do today, or at least as they have tended to conceive of it over the past 2 centuries, as a right secured by law and protected in the courts. We should rather place Milton's concept of free speech in the tradition of Renaissance humanism that was so vital to Milton the poet. As the historian James Hankins has shown in his formidable recent book, Virtue Politics, Statecraft and Soulcraft in Renaissance Italy. For the humanists of Renaissance Italy who sought to recover the cultural and political values of ancient Greece and Rome as modes of living in a Christian world, free speech was a virtue. To speak with freedom, to advocate what was right, especially before a tyrant or a howling mob, was a great virtue that required other virtues such as prudence and courage. It could only proceed from a strong soul that cared for the right. And Milton was intensely fascinated by the world of Renaissance humanism, particularly writers like Petrarch. We read Milton anachronistically if we fail to recognize that free speech is for him, as for the great Renaissance humanists that he so admired, primarily the exercise of virtuous character, not a universal right enshrined in law. Crucially, however, the Renaissance humanists also believed in what Hankins calls virtue egalitarianism. Everyone can acquire the virtue of free speech as they can acquire any other virtue through education. This is why it's no coincidence that the other work that Milton published in 1644, a few months before Areopagitica, was entitled Of Education, and is a treatise on the ideal method of educating England's youth for leadership positions in the post-Civil War nation. Now, in a very interesting recent book, Farah Dabhoiwala has said, the book's called What is Free Speech? The History of a Dangerous Idea, published last year. Farah Dabhoiwala is somewhat dismissive of the historical importance of Areopagitica, because he thinks that for Milton, like other Puritans of the time, as he puts it, the capacity to discern truth from falsehood depended upon divine inspiration, on the light within, given only to the elect. Dabhoiwala is right to say that free speech for Milton had nothing to do with rights, but I think he's mistaken to assume that Milton conceives of truth in terms of a kind of Calvinist division between elect and reprobate, which is the theological doctrine held rather by the Puritans, who called for Milton's writings to be suppressed. For it is precisely in Areopagitic that Milton first articulates his conviction that virtue is the product of the free will that every human being can exercise through reason. And this is Areopagitica again. If every action which is good or evil in man at ripe years were to be under pittance and prescription and compulsion, what were virtue but a name? What praise could then be due to well-doing? What gramercy to be sober, just, or continent? Debates and seeming pleasures, and yet abstain, and yet distinguish, and yet prefer that which is truly better. He is the true warfaring Christian. I cannot praise a fugitive in cloistered virtue, unexercised and unbreathed, that never sallies out and sees her adversary, but slinks out of the race, where that immortal garland is to be run for, not without dust and heat. Assuredly we bring not innocence into the world, we bring impurity, much rather. That which purifies us is trial, and trial is by what is contrary. So for Milton, life is a continual trial of one's virtue, and one must constantly choose between good and evil in books and ideas, as in all other things. A cloistered virtue, a virtue that has not been tested, is no virtue at all. And Paradise Lost, which I'm not going to talk about, is Milton's ultimate meditation on the origin of human existence itself as a trial of virtue. Milton argues then not for legal rights for the universal protection of free speech, but rather against legislation that risks suppressing the virtue of free speech. He prefers to see what he calls those unwritten or at least unconstraining laws of virtuous education act as the bones and ligaments of the Commonwealth. Education should ideally take the place of legal constraint. Truth will emerge from a process of sifting good from evil, which Milton imagines as a form of intellectual combat. Let her truth and falsehood grapple. Whoever knew truth put to the worse in a free and open encounter. Her confuting is the best and surest suppressing. Here Milton's arguments most clearly anticipate the concept of the marketplace of ideas that's often invoked in debates about the freedom of the press in liberal democracies. Thomas Jefferson, channeling Areopagitica in his act for establishing religious freedom, declared that truth is great and will prevail if left to herself. Truth is always feminized in these quotations. She is the proper and sufficient antagonist to fear from the conflict, unless by human interposition disarmed of her natural weapons, free argument and debate. One aspect of Milton's arguments against pre-publication licensing, still on this page. One aspect of Milton's arguments against pre-publication licensing is indeed an insistence that Parliament's re-imposition of licensing was influenced by lobbying from the Company of Stationers, whom he accused of seeking to retain a commercial monopoly on the print trade. His images of truth sometimes continue this commercial theme as he transfers the charge of monopoly from economic to intellectual and religious contexts. Truth and understanding, second quotation on the handout, are not such wares as to be monopolized and traded in by tickets and statutes and standards. So to allow any interest group to control the circulation of ideas in the way that a company seeks to control the market in pursuit of its own profit will lead to the general intellectual and spiritual poverty of a society. Okay, so this brings me, I'm coming to a conclusion. This brings me to this notion of the free market of ideas, returns us to the present day. And a quotation with which I began, which I've given in longer form here, which exemplifies the increasing pessimism that truth can ever triumph over falsehood in a digital marketplace. In the age of metadata and micro-targeting of voters, it has become rather obvious that John Milton, in his iconic Areopagitica, might have been naive to posit that falsity invariably loses out to truth in the marketplace of political ideas. Milton arguably did not understand social psychology in an age of siloed voters in echo chamber environments. I don't think there's any, arguably, I don't think really needs to be there. When truth and falsity wrestle in today's marketplace of political ideas, falsity plays dirty and kicks truth's ass. We have something like 50 million Americans who concept of an untrammeled, deregulated marketplace of ideas, and Milton's demand for an absence of legislation, which would allow readers to choose the good and the true and reject the false and the evil. Milton, I don't think, was a free marketeer. As we have seen, free speech for Milton means to advocate for what is right, and it can only properly be the product of a virtuous character developed through education. Consequently, he accepts in Areopagitica that there will be books so impious or evil, is the first quotation, so impious or evil absolutely either against faith or manners, no law can possibly permit them. And that if anonymous publications are judged mischievous and libelous, then the fire and the executioner will be the timeliest and the most effectual remedy that man's prevention can use. And it's not quite clear there when he says executioner, if he's still using the metaphor of books as people, or he really means the executioner of the author. So in other words, he does say, let heretical and dangerous ideas be published, then judge them. If they are found wanting, suppression may be appropriate. Ideas shouldn't be censored in advance of their airing, an act that Milton compares to a kind of intellectual stillbirth. The issue of the brain should no more be stifled than the issue of the womb, as he puts it. But of course, this qualification about impious and evil books or mischievous and libelous books, this qualification raises the perennial question of who decides on the harmful effects of a text after its publication. These lines about the fire and the executioner are habitually cited to prove the sharp limits or elitism of Miltonic liberty. The conviction that books can be suppressed after publication, if they are found impious or evil, derives, though, from Milton's understanding of virtue as the exercise of reason in choosing between good and evil. And not only was he insistent in Areopagitica that evil books should be suppressed once they had been judged to be so, but adamant also that those who sought to espouse intolerance should themselves be denied the freedom to do so. This is the second quotation. Yet if all cannot be of one mind, as who looks they should be, this doubtless is more wholesome, more prudent, and more Christian, that many be tolerated rather than all compelled. A nice argument in favour of toleration. I mean, no, not tolerated popery and open superstition, which, as it extirpates all religions and civil supremacies, so itself should be extirpate, provided first that all charitable and compassionate means be used to win and regain the weak and the misled. Now, the concluding qualification about the importance of education and persuasion is usually left out by those seeking to show that Milton was at heart a religious bigot and that his ideas about free speech and intellectual liberty have little to teach us about liberalism today. But I think it's important to recognize that popery for Milton encompassed not only the Inquisition and the conditions of censorship that he associated with Catholic states like Italy, but any group who sought to suppress the truth out of self-interest. Chiefly the Puritan clergy who had called for his own persecution over the divorce tracts. Milton epitomized this view in the devastating final line of one of the ferocious satirical poems that he wrote in the aftermath of the reception of his writings on divorce, on the new forces of conscience under the Long Parliament. This is the only poetry in the lecture. Men whose life, learning, faith, and pure intent would have been held in high esteem with Paul must now be named and printed heretics, i.e. Milton himself. And the final line, new presbyter is but old priest writ large. Milton remains vague on whether he means that pre-publication censorship might, after all, be permissible in the case of those who would seek to impose the structural repression of free speech by extirpating or destroying utterly all differing forms of belief in government, and in doing so suppress the conditions for virtue. But the issue of whether we should tolerate those who would take advantage of freedom of speech to encourage intolerance is today more urgent and live than it has ever been, whether in relation to hate speech, religious extremism, or fake news. And I'll close with a more optimistic quotation. In a stirring piece on the situation in America in the Financial Times last autumn, Simon Schama asked, "What's a despairing citizen to do? You could do worse by way of tonic than drink from the fountainhead of free speech, John Milton's Areopagitica. Avoid fatalism and despair. Heed Milton in his impatience with fugitive and cloistered virtue, unexercised and unbreathed, that never sallies out and sees her adversary, but slinks out of the race. Troll less and reason more. Make the defence of freedom something more than a shopping opportunity. Make it heroic again." Now, I heartily agree with those fine words, and we might add that for Milton, educating the youth of the Republic was the means to establish the virtue of free speech in society. But we should also, I think, acknowledge that Milton's lessons in free speech are not straightforward ones, and in not being so, they may in fact be more relevant to the problems of our age. Milton, writing amid a devastating civil war, finally maintained that societies can foster intellectual liberty only by somehow excluding or restraining those who would deny it. In its articulation with unsurpassed eloquence of these problems that continue to bedevil liberalism, I will contend the arguments of Areopagitica still matter in the information age. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, for am I on? Yeah. Thank you for a fascinating talk and reminding us there's nothing new under the sun, really. I did wonder, when you were talking about anonymous lies, if Milton did say anything about the idea that whether there should be rules against, I guess, trolling, being anonymous and saying things that you didn't believe. Did he think that there was a duty to put your name to what you wrote? Or should be a legal duty even? Or?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yes, so that's final quotation, one of the final quotations where he talks about mischievous or libelous books. He's actually talking particularly about works, published works that do not have a name, anonymous works. So that's particularly the works that he's thinking of, that should be, when he's thinking about potential post-publication suppression.
Right.
And of course, the irony is, of course, he didn't put his own name to the Doctrine and Discipline of Divorce when he first published it. He only added it to the second edition. So he was doing something that he himself had been charged with. But yes, so I think, if you're talking about trolling, yes, I mean, anonymized attacks, libelous attacks are something he's particularly concerned with, is making a qualification for in terms of suppression.
Yeah. And the other thing that I was interested in that you were talking about was his real concern with the Stationers' Company being that it was an economic monopoly and therefore would lead to a monopoly of ideas. And that's one of the things I think that people would get very unhappy about today, with the very few people who control. I'm just thinking about Elon Musk and X, for example, that he said he wanted to be an absolute free market of ideas, but actually if there are ideas that he doesn't like, that he suppresses, or he plays the algorithms so that ideas he does like get more. I mean, do you think Milton would have been more sympathetic? He seems to suggest it's just education and teaching of virtue that should somehow be the police person of ideas. But I mean, did he ever have any ideas, sort of more practical ideas about how he might do that?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, yes. I think there is, analogies with the present are always tricky. But I think you're right that there is, and that's why he can sometimes sound like he's a kind of free marketeer, because he does use this anti-monopolistic language in terms of thinking about the circulation of ideas. And it is aimed at the stationers' company, so yes, I mean, any large company that tries to monopolize the sort of means of production of knowledge is something that he attacks and is worried by. And he sees that as part of a larger issue of tyranny, which he connects with the church and Charles I eventually as well. You know, there's a logical movement in his ideas, I would argue, to the point where he also justifies the execution of Charles I and the establishment of a republic, because it's part of a tyranny of trying to control knowledge, prevent intellectual liberty. And so it leads him to quite radical places eventually. The other part of the question was after monopoly.
Well, just because it was an economic, did he disapprove of any form of regulation?
Yeah.
I'm just thinking, monopolies were very, very political at that time, because basically they were being sold.
Yeah.
They weren't monopolies that were designed to be a regulatory mechanism for the public good. They were
Yeah.
being sold to fund the king, doing things that people like Milton would have thought were...
Yeah, he generally wasn't someone who was a practical instrument. He wasn't someone who was saying, this is the kind of institution we should set up. However, in Of Education, which is this other little tract that he published just before Areopagitica, he does offer a blueprint for the kind of ideal school. Now, this is his kind of ideal school is, learning Latin and Greek before you're, 8, moving on to a bit of Hebrew, doing modern languages in your spare time. It's an extremely probably utopian idea of education. But the basic function of education is to instill virtue.
Yeah.
And so I think, I was trying to think about this in terms of today. I mean, I think it's been mentioned, the idea of having classes in critical thinking at school that teach you or instruct you on how to distinguish truth from falsehood in the current world. I think that's the kind of thing that I think Milton could see as a practical solution to some of the issues.
Yeah.
So I think he's education is key, and that's why I was trying to say that it's not law but education. So he's not interested in the practical legislation. He would rather see legislation taken away, and education as the invisible laws, as he calls it, that are installed in society. So I think there are. You have to work hard to work out some of his practical ideas and how they might be updated, but they are there, I think.
An anarchist as well as a regicide.
Well, yeah, no, wouldn't go that far, no.
Okay, well, I'm going to open this up to questions, and I can see a hand here. If you could just wait for the microphone, please, and then see if there's any other.
Thank you very much. I've been looking all day for the quotation, which I found now on page 137 about truth and falsehood in a competition. My question is, do you think that in this country, both in Parliament and in the churches, we no longer believe that you can discover the truth through debate, which is not the same as a contest between truth and falsehood. It is a matter of discovering that the so-called falsehood might actually have some truth. We no longer believe that. Do you agree?
Sort of. I mean, if you go back to the English Civil War, I mean, go back to the 1640s. I mean, the attacks that were, the published attacks on the other side were often, obvious caricatures, falsehoods, made-up stories about people. So, I mean, all of that still went on in the 1640s, the way it does in the kind of political scenario you see today, where people are slandered, often without much evidence. So, I think it's not been a linear, a downward spiral from a position where I think debate was a more objective concept. However, I do think the lack of virtue in public life is very, and people have written about this, I think, over the last decade or so. The lack of virtue in public life is something that is noticeable. And I think that is linked to what you describe, which is an unwillingness to debate in that manner,
There's a hand at the back there. Just nearly at the back. Yes, you.
Thank you, Professor McDowell. I think it's perhaps fair to say that Milton's not always the best at disagreeing agreeably. if we look at the likes of the Defensios, or, for instance, his Christological writings in De Doctrina, it's rife with, you know, a lot of vitriol. And I don't mean this as a gotcha. I work with it and I enjoy it myself. But I wonder if you think, in this regard, whether there are things, and I suppose this is quite a similar question to the first, that we can learn from how Milton did his public debate.
Well, you're quite right to say that Milton's absolutely excoriating of anybody who disagrees with him. I mean, you got a touch of it from the sonnet that I quoted at the end, where he is a paragon of virtue who's being slandered unfairly by his enemies. However, I think genre does play a role in this. I mean, he has different modes of addressing issues. So Areopagitica has its elements of satire, but it's predominantly a kind of oration that's pronouncing a way forward, and the way that the society should be developed. Whereas other pamphlets, some of his, he's got other responses to the divorce tracts where he is an ad hominem satirist, and he'll go all out using all sorts of slurs. I think one of the critics of his divorce tracts, he calls him, because he thinks he's a servant. He thinks he's a servant. He's not. He just makes this up and then uses lots of class-based slurs to denigrate his opponent's education. But I think genre, I think there are certain moods that he writes in where he has a different. So sometimes the satire is there with the more lofty orations, but I think there are moods in which he can move into something loftier and live up to some of his own principles.
Yeah, just out of interest, I came to the talk today because my name is John Milton. I'll show you my passport if you're interested. What do you make of the irony? Well, you've already hinted at it, really, that that in an age of such attraction to materialism and tyranny, that it's the supposed proponents of Protestantism in America who are opposed to liberalism, and the greatest popular defender of populism in the world today is the head of the church that Milton despised, the Catholic Pope.
Well, I think that's a very interesting point. I mean, I think the point hopefully I was trying to make is that popery for Milton is a concept as much as it is linked to any particular church or institution. So the Puritans, the Protestants who attacked him, were as popish as the Pope, because they were just repeating the same attempts to prevent intellectual liberty that he identified with the Catholic Church. So I don't think he'd be surprised by that particularly. I don't, the Puritans on the sort of right, as it were, if we were crude about it, being opponents of free speech would be grist to Milton's mill. I don't think he'd be surprised by that at all. He might be a bit more surprised by yes, the Pope being the beacon of liberty. That might be more of a surprise to him. But on the other side, I don't think so. I should say also, this is one of the great misunderstandings about Milton, that he is a Puritan. He doesn't actually fulfill many of the ideas that we normally attach to Puritanism. He does some, but a lot of the most important ones he doesn't at all, especially theologically, but also intellectually, I would argue. Sorry.
No, not at all. Thank you so much for your talk. I really found it fascinating. And one thing I noted is that across the sort of Milton quotes that you put up, some of them were prose, other ones were verse. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how Milton might have been strategic with genre in terms of, whether to present something in prose or in verse, when sort of defending things, what kind of audiences he was trying to reach with one version, one genre over the other.
Well, that's a very good question, and you're right that he tends to sometimes separate the poet. I mean, his famous line is that he writes prose with his left hand, poetry with his right, and the left hand is not his ideal. He's writing with his left hand because he has to, because the intellectual conditions require him to do so. So I think what he sees eventually is that he can only write with his right hand. He can only write the poetry that he wants to write if the social and intellectual conditions are established, allowing him to do so, and that's why he turns to the left hand. So I tend to search for consistency in Milton. Other people will find, rank hypocrisy or discordance. I always find it kind of dispiriting to look for self-contradiction. I try to find consistency. So I think that's how I would link the two up. But it's true to say that that the poem that I quoted there is unusual in using poetry to address a contemporary issue. And for the most part, his poetry doesn't directly do that, Paradise Lost being the great example. But I hope some of the quotations there about Adam and the origins of free will and choosing between good and evil make it clear that Paradise Lost is always a political poem, even if it never addresses the direct sort of minutiae of the 1640s and 1650s. So that's and of course the great irony is he writes the epic poem that he said he wouldn't be able to write until the conditions of liberty were restored in England under the Restoration, the restored monarchy, the restored Church of England. After he's been imprisoned, after he's just about escaped with his life, it's then that he finishes his epic poem, and that's why there's such an error. That's why it's Paradise Lost. It's a poem about what's been lost, not gained through the war. But he still goes on to write it under those conditions.
Thanks so much for your lecture. I wanted to ask you a bit more about writing as opposed to speech, and orality and literacy. When I teach Milton every year, and when we read Areopagitica, I often point out that Isocrates had a stammer, and hence he didn't publicly deliver his edicts in speech. He had them circulated in pamphlet form, as far as I understand it, or in written form. And I was trying to think about how dependent on the idea of print and the book Areopagitica is, and how odd it is that we always talk about free speech, as though this is about what people say in public. Yeah. And I suppose I was just wondering what you thought about the extent to which Milton is, to a certain extent, sort of concealing the presence of print and writing. I mean, even when I think about Paradise Lost, it seems to me that it's about the writing. It's where he places that verb at the end of a line on which everything depends, which is hard to gather if you're just reading out loud, or if you're, as classical speakers did, delivering oral poetry. So, yeah, I think it's a kind of question about what is this freedom. It's really about the freedom of print rather than the freedom of the spoken word in public.
Yes, I think that's right. Although I guess we tend to use free speech as a shorthand today for things that don't, aren't delivered orally. It's a very good point, though. He does. I mean, I think he has an idea of himself in Areopagitica as literally standing outside Parliament delivering this. But of course, he didn't. He did it. He wrote it in his study in Aldersgate Street, in a rather nice house with a garden. So he wasn't out there, as far as we know, anyway. It doesn't seem like he was out there on the streets, as it were, delivering this as an impassioned speech. I think that one of the reasons why it is interesting in the contemporary climate, and it always will be interesting, is technological change and the fact that it seems to me that Milton's quite deliberately kind of playing with the fact that it is now, you can't go, well, Socrates didn't anyway, but you can't go in front of the Areopagus and explain your ideas to the entire city. The city-state print is now the way that you negotiate and deliver your arguments. And of course, then that creates a disconnect, as you say, between the person who delivers, the person and the text. Yeah. So I think that is one of the things he's most interested in, and that's that disembodiment, if you like, of the text is what. I think that's what he thinks. I think if everybody could see who he was and how learned he was, none of the problems may have arisen that arose over the divorce tracts. So yeah, I mean that's good. I mean, that's about all I would say on it at the minute. I do think it's very much important to the idea of the work to play on that tension.
I was wondering today, Trump's just given this huge sort of social media rant, and the extent to which there's a kind of Trump seems to get more anchorage or leverage when he puts something out on social, Truth Social, than when we actually hear him speak in public.
Yeah.
When he does speak.
in the longer version of this talk, which I gave in London a few months ago, I do actually quote a pamphlet by George Wither, who you'll know, which is a record of a speech he gave outside the doors of Parliament, demanding the kind of same rights of free speech that the MPs had within the Parliament. And that is, you know, he talks about himself in being right there, as if he is delivering it, even though it's obviously recorded afterwards. So Milton had that example. It was just before Areopagitic, so I mean, Milton could have had that example, but he doesn't go down that route. It's more, yeah, the scholar in his room, which of course he has that great vision of as well.
All right, well, I think we're kind of pretty much out of time. But before I ask you to join me in thanking Nick for that extraordinarily fascinating lecture, bringing ideas from Milton's time into their relevance for our own, I just wanted to tell you about next week's talk, which is by Sam Doubley, who's the Director of Technology, Rights and Investigations at Human Rights Watch. And he will be talking about how they use digital tools, including satellite imagery and social media verifications and AI, to try to uncover and expose human rights violations and war crimes remotely. So perhaps some of the troubles of technology in suppressing speech, the uses of technology to expose truth. But thank you very much, Nick, for delivering a fascinating presentation.